shows up on YouTube here, but I see that it looks like it's kind of all ready to go. So, hello, my friends. I'm Adam. Welcome to EdTech with Adam, and we have a very special discussion today where we have Zack Hartzman and Phill Cameron. So Zack Hartzman, amazing, amazing person. Phill Cameron, also extremely amazing person. And we're going to start off just with a little. We're going to start with a moment of silence led by Phill. And Phill, if you'd like to just describe
Yeah.
what it is and
So,
what you'd like us to do, please go ahead.
yeah, so there's a lot of um, social unrest happening in addition to the rest of the world, and it's important to remember that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Protests usually only get aired when there's violence, but the protests are still ongoing, as a matter of fact. And so I'd like to take a moment to quietly contemplate this slide. Um, and it'll just be a minute, and it may feel very long to you, but I promise I won't make you think more than a minute before we get started. So just 1 minute of silence.
Okay. Okay. No problem. No, and I totally appreciate and respect that. It's definitely something that we, as teachers, educators, leaders, really need to step up and make sure that we're doing our best to make sure that we're using our voices to make a difference. And I stand alongside all the other people who are telling us that if you're not using your voice to make a change, then you're part of the problem as well, right?
Yep.
So yeah, how about we go right ahead into some introductions here. So either one of you, whoever like to just take the floor and just tell us who you are and what you do, and yeah,
Sure,
please go
I'll
ahead.
defer to Zach.
Sure. So I'm Zack Hartzman, and I'm a high school social studies teacher in the Bronx in New York City. Social studies, and I teach an elective course also. I teach 11th and 12th graders. The school I teach at it's an international, so it's in the public school system, but it's an international school dedicated to newly arrived immigrants and English language learners. So while I teach social studies, I am responsible for teaching them English as a second language. And in addition to social studies, I also teach a video game literature elective course where we play and analyze video games as literature, because I've found that they work in different ways, especially in language development. And then I'm also the founder of HeyListenGames, where I put all my curriculum and lesson plans and everything I've made up for free for other people to use, since there are not many resources out there for teachers who are interested in using video games in the classroom. And that's about it.
Excellent, Zach. Thank you.
Yeah.
And welcome.
Yes, thank you.
Welcome. My name is Phill Cameron. I work at the Language Resource Center at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. I'm an instructional designer there and a game designer in some other parts of my life. And so I work to integrate games into language learning, very similar to Zach. Not necessarily, well, I do a lot of work with our English Language Institute. And then I also work with primarily German and Italian, Spanish departments, and then slowly building them into other less commonly taught languages like Hindi, Punjabi, Urdu. And anyone that's interested, really. I do a lot of regular design work, And then when people come to me with ideas, sometimes I gently push them towards sort of gameful mechanics or ways of thinking about it. That's me.
Excellent. Thank you, Phill, and welcome to you as well. And I guess last, my name is Adam Sheard, and I think some people know me already, but I am a teacher at the University of British Columbia, and I also work to an extent as an instructional designer and ed tech coordinator and all other kinds of fun, interesting things. But yeah, I'm kind of a little bit of a mix of both of you here. I do a bit on the instructional side, but I also do quite a bit on the instructional designer side as well. And I mostly teach kind of sociolinguistics and language, various languages. So I speak Japanese and Korean and Chinese. So I do a bunch of these other languages as well. And I try my best to incorporate video games in my classrooms as well because, I'm a huge gamer and I'm a big fan of the whole field and everything like that. Yeah, so I thought we did go from here and then just go into some of the examples of what exactly we're doing right now in our learning environments to try to incorporate some video games and how we're trying to use them in a kind of a pedagogically sound way. And maybe we can go with the order we had before. Zach, would you like to just lead us off and tell us about some of the cool stuff you're doing?
Yeah. So like I said, I teach two different things. So what I do, so there's different ways to use games in social studies. I like to find games to kind of supplement whatever content I'm already teaching. So like a classic example is every year when I teach about, so I usually teach United States history now. Mm-hmm. So when I teach about immigration and the various immigration issues over the course of United States history, at some point I'll bring in the game Papers, Please, which is a game about, right, you play as a border patrol agent, right? And you basically are in charge of deciding who gets to come into your fictional country, right? So even though the game is completely fictional, it's made up, but it's based in reality. It pulls from things that have happened. So I like to have and I usually play together as a class. So we'll have students play the game together as a class for one period, and then they can make comparisons to stuff that they've seen in the past, the stuff that's happening right now, right at the southern border. And that's just what, like, when I teach about like culture and how culture is represented in different mediums, I'll even use a game like Super Mario Odyssey, right, and have them play through different levels of that game, because they do like bring you to different countries in that world that are inspired by different real places. So there's different fun ways to bring in games, and they're never replacing other traditional texts. We're still reading all the primary source documents, all right. Mm-hmm. I don't use textbooks, but right, we're still using all the other traditional means of learning, quote unquote. Mm-hmm. But I will bring in games as a supplement, right, to kind of reinforce what's already being taught. And then in my I created my video game literature course because before COVID-19, right, our students in New York had to take the New York State Regents exam in English language arts. Mm-hmm. And it's a graduation requirement. And for my students, that's the biggest hindrance to graduation, because English is not their native language. Mm-hmm. And there are two parts that are both different types of essays, right? So I created curriculum where instead of just reading plain text and writing a literary analysis essay or an argumentative essay, they play video games and do the same thing. So like we played Gone Home and What Remains of Edith Finch, two wonderful games, and they would look for and analyze the various literary elements found in those games, like conflict, plot, characterization, point of view, right? So it's a fun and different way to get them engaged with the content that they're already learning in other classes. And it's gone really well. They all love it.
Yeah, the part, I think I asked you before about this as well, but the thing that really intrigues me is that you were mentioning you teach these on like the overhead projector in front of class, so not every student has a copy of the game, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, because I know one of the main concerns that teachers always have is how do you get it funded? How do you pay for every kid to have a copy? Do all kids have consoles at home? And I don't do any of that. So, because I bring in usually my Nintendo Switch and I just connect it to the TV. We have the Promethean screens in the front of the room, and I'll have one student be the player, right? Because not every student needs to be playing at the same time, right? One student can be playing and the rest of the class can either help them out and tell them where to go, or they're just conversing about what's happening on screen the same way as if you were watching a movie, documentary, or any other type of video.
Mm-hmm. And you said you also get the students to take turns, right? Like sometimes they go up and one person at a time controls it, or do you usually guide them through it?
So I'll only step in if they're lost and it's becoming a time waster. But usually, so like in my video game course, I'll have them rotate boy girl. So one boy plays for a day, one girl plays for a day, one boy plays for a day, one girl plays for a day.
Mm-hmm. That's cool. And so when you first brought this in, though, like what was the kind of the administrative sort of, I don't want to say pushback. I don't want to assume that there was pushback on this, but like when you first came up with this idea and said that you wanted to do this in your classes, like what did the administration say?
Show me the standards and outcomes that it adheres to, and because my administration super open-minded, super receptive. They've over the years have let me, every time I go in, it's like, oh, I want to teach with this movie. Oh, I want to teach with this comic book. I want to teach with this graphic novel. They've always been like, okay, we trust that you're gonna get to where you need to get, right? Just show us how you're gonna get there. So especially once I laid out the entire curriculum, right? They were just like, you know what you're doing. Go ahead and do it. So I luckily had no pushback at all.
Well, that's wonderful to hear.
Yeah. I know that won't be the case for everyone out there.
Yeah. Well, how about Phill? Why don't you tell us a little bit about, you're mentioning that you work with a lot of instructors who might be incorporating some games. So how has that gone for you? What kind of stuff have you been doing there?
Yeah. I'll talk about one of my favorite projects. Different from K-12, obviously, is a university environment, and learners of English as their second language are often faculty or TAs. And so we worked with the English Language Institute and Brenda Imber specifically there. And what we realized is that many TAs have trouble formulating explanations about their labs that they are teaching. And it turns out that teaching someone how to play a board game basically maps almost exactly to teaching someone how to use a lab, right? There's a preamble, there's the explanation, there's the step-by-steps, and then there's the attending and the troubleshooting. What often happens with these graduate students is that they're very comfortable in their domain knowledge, but none of them play games because they, quote unquote, don't have time to it. And so have time to do it. So what we forced them to do was learn new games very quickly and then teach those games to each other. And so we have a series of games that my colleagues and I curated that were in this sweet spot of needs explanation and has lots of questions, but isn't 4 hours to set up and 12 hours to play, sort of like Arkham Horror type board games, right? And so in this English language class, these students who were going to soon be instructors were forced out of their domain comfort zones, and then they had to learn to teach these games to each other. And so they were very engaged with the games because games are engaging, but they were also engaged with the process of learning to teach in addition to teaching the games. And that was really cool. And it was really nice to see the outcomes because, again, once you have a structure in place, you can start to synergize and like place that into other areas of your life. And they all did really well on that, based around the fact that we forced them to like play Pandemic and teach other people to play Pandemic and like what were the other ones? We used board games and video games. So Carcassonne Online, like the Super Nintendo game Lost Dwarfs from Blizzard. Yep. And like teaching people how to play that and then asking questions and like lots of procedural language in addition to other structural language. It was, everyone had a good time there and learned something.
So I guess in that case, you worked together with the teachers and the teachers came up with sort of like the grammatical or like the different things they wanted to teach through the games, and then they made lesson plans for that, or?
Yeah, we worked to set up the lesson plans with them, and then the specific points that we wanted them to cover during their that we wanted the students to recognize and see during the gameplay. And so like our initial testing was, does this actually do what we think it will do? And then yes, you do have to have a structure, and there is a structure that better explanations of games have, and that then maps to these structures that teachers need to use when they're teaching in like a chemistry or a bio lab. Right? So yeah, they mapped those out. We made sure that they fit into the games, and then we helped them choose the games that best matched that. Yeah.
Okay. So in this sense, you were saying you're working a lot with the TAs to get through the TAs to teach the classes, or was it like
this is a step above that, right? So these
Okay.
are the students in the class that this is for are going to be TAs like next semester or next year. And then we worked with their instructor, teaching them this domain-specific language around teaching at the University of Michigan. Yeah.
And I'm guessing because you had to work with a lot of personnel in that sense, it also brought up sort of the challenge of, I guess, game proficiency itself and kind of that proficiency in tech to be able to tackle that, right?
Yeah, University of Michigan is super blessed to have what's known as the CVGA, the Computer and Video Games Archive, which is a tremendous resource. Other people could, like, if you don't have that resource, you could certainly bring in your own games to have people play and explain to one another. But that is staffed by a librarian named Val Waldron, and she was instrumental in helping us like handle the tech part. But because a majority of the games were actually board games that we played in class, this was obviously pre-COVID, and like laid out, like that was the space that we did it in, was this sort of mini video game and board game archive and library. These days, there are enough games online that mapped to the ones that we use that I think you could do it remotely, which would be nice. But yeah, the tech itself was actually sort of an intentional barrier, because we didn't want them to just play a game that they already knew really well. We wanted to take them out of any of their comfort zones when explaining a particular topic. Yep.
Great. Yeah, it sounds like a great process, and I'm very jealous that you have that computer and video game archive. That sounds pretty cool to have something like that on campus. Something we don't have out in my campus. I'm not sure, Zach, you guys have any kinds of, I guess, archives for games or anything like that at your school?
Just my personal library.
Yeah. No,
which is expensive, but...
Yeah. Actual libraries are good for that too. Usually interlibrary loans, like for local city libraries, can get you games and board games as well.
Oh, cool.
Yep.
No, I know we do have board game loans at our local library, but I don't think we have any video games as far as I last checked. But I know it is something that I've seen libraries in the States actually that do have games on the shelves there. I was surprised. I thought I just walked into like a Blockbuster or something. It was crazy, but yeah, it's unfortunately in Canada not something we're too super keen on yet, but hopefully something that we get into soon.
Yeah, video games and the permissions around digital content is very interesting, but that's
it is, yeah.
a different conversation.
Yes. Well, in my example, I was trying to implement games into ESL classes, and so I actually had a few summer series that I did where I had, of course, I was teaching ESL, and one of the big goals was to teach a variety of specific vocabulary words, so thematic vocabulary words for kind of like an EAP, which is English for Academic Purposes. And so I wanted to tackle a few different areas of EAP. I wanted to tackle things like biology, science, technology, and all these kinds of things. And so I used some things like Artemis Spaceship Simulator. I'm not sure if you've heard of that, but basically you have a spaceship, and then for each different device, you have a different role in the spaceship, like an engineer or a captain or like helmsman, all this kind of stuff. And because we have these computer labs, we had the computer lab divided into 3 spaceships, and then the students would go into their own group and do that, and they'd be able to speak, and then we'd have target grammar points, target speaking points, and things like that for them to try to focus on while they're getting into this game and doing this. And I also use things like Surgeon Simulator for biology vocabulary words to try to introduce a handful of like surgical style, medical style vocabulary words and stuff like that as well. And we did a whole bunch of other ones. Keep Talking and No One Explodes.
Yep, that's a fun one.
Yeah, that one was especially valuable, especially a lot of the students. They don't have that pressure to speak, and a lot of them who are quiet. That was one of the first times I've seen a lot of quiet students really speak up and really actively participate in conversations, because if they don't, they're on the hook for the bomb or their team or what have you, and it just creates so many great opportunities for those kinds of things. But yeah, that's mostly what I did. I spent a lot of time setting these up, and I had the wonderful support of my IT department as well to come in. And fortunately, after a whole bunch of struggle and applications, I was able to convince my administration that it was something that was worthwhile and pedagogically sound. And then they sprung for licenses for all of the games, which is really cool. But yeah, it still was. It was very interesting. It was a very fun thing to do, and the students really liked that as well.
Nice.
And so I also wanted to kind of go into, so in your experiences, what was your best experience and what was your worst experience with using games in classes? Whoever wants to go first.
Best experience, maybe. So I guess there's a couple different ways I can go about this. One, so because I teach at a international school, the nature of my population, a lot of them just have never played video games before because they just don't have consoles available. Especially a lot of my students from West Africa have never really had the opportunity to play, especially modern consoles.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's like compounded for my girls from West Africa who have never been, in many cases, allowed to play video games. So them coming into my class is really the first time that a lot of them are playing, and it's best experience. Seeing them get into it is just amazing because they want to. They see their brothers and their cousins and their friends playing this, especially during I have a million students in my classroom during lunchtime. Usually, not anymore. Usually, in my classroom during lunchtime, playing, especially Super Smash Brothers. So they're seeing that and they want to participate, but they haven't had that safe space to advocate for themselves. So just giving them the opportunity to do that in classroom, just seeing them light up at the chance to play, and even if they struggle, because there's a whole literacy around how to use a controller, right? If you've never held one, it is confusing. So even to have another student come and sit next to them and guide them through the controls as they play, right? It's just a really rewarding experience to give them that opportunity. And then the classic example I always go to with this type of question is one of my students, brilliant, really smart kid, but he is notoriously a bad writer. He's a terrible writer because verbally he's fluent in English, but his writing skills never developed greatly because he would never actually practice writing. And in this course, when we finished playing Gone Home, I assigned them to write a review of the game as if they were writing for a magazine or a website. And he sat down for an hour in the corner. He put himself in the corner of the classroom and wrote out 3 pages about the game. Right. And for someone like this kid, that's unheard of. And he just graduated. He's now on a full ride scholarship to a private school for a video game development program. Right. And
Nice.
The part of that is because of the class, right? He was not thinking about going into game development, right? He always liked games as a hobby, but he originally wanted to be a lawyer, right? So he completely shifted course after he saw that he could be doing more with games, especially as he learned more about how he wants, because he's from the Dominican Republic, right? And he wants more people of color developing video games also, as he's gotten more into the industry.
That's awesome.
That's really cool.
Yeah, it's great too that you provided that safe space for your students where they could like go and build their communities around it. That's really nice to hear.
Yeah, this really reminds me of like I back in my grad studies, one of the courses I took was about the validity of text and different forms of text, and how we go through all these phases in human history where at first we were writing on stone tablets, and then someone came out and said, "Oh, here's a scroll." Have you seen the Monty Python skit where they talk about the whole scroll and tablet thing? And a guy comes in with this scroll, and he goes into like this like ancient monk monastery tech support, and he's like, "What's a scroll? How does this thing work?" And then the guy has to show him how it works. And then they show like 1,000 years later when they bring out the printed book, and this time it's a guy who's like, "Well, I know what the scroll is, and now I'm trying to figure out how to use this. What am I supposed to do with it? You open up the front. Wait. So I open up the front. How do I go back? So if you want to go back, you close the book like this. And then, okay, so how do I see like a certain? Okay, you want to open. Wait, hold on, slow down. Can you do that again? Okay, you open up the book, and it's like this. We go through these phases of what we consider valid text, but one of the things that we really look at is the fact that a lot of people, they when a new form of text comes out, the people who have already been used to the old forms of text are very resistant to the notion that these new forms of text could be considered, for example, like valid literature or valid text. And even up until now, I know there are a lot of people who say, people who are texting on their phones using numbers instead of words, like for you, and then writing you, just the letter instead of the word. And we have a lot of criticism about that, even up until now, just almost as much as we have criticism as games being legitimate literature. But, Zach, you just mentioned, a lot of these games, they can be very just as valid as a regular form of literature. They're very well made, very masterfully made. They hire just as many artists and writers as you'd have writing a professional piece of literature or something like that, right? So it's a very interesting point, though, about how we need to really take a look at what text means, especially to the younger generations, and see how they're interpreting it, to really try to accommodate them, because a lot of students might be used to this. They might be playing Fortnite 6 hours a day, and that's their literacy, that's their world. And to step back and say, "No, here's a book, you got to read this," it doesn't always work that way, right? That's a great example.
Right. We should be meeting them where they are, right? If they're so literate in this thing, why not bring that skill that they have into the classroom?
Mm-hmm. And I know the Norwegian EdTech Society recently they were raving about students and teachers using WeChat, the Chinese texting app, in their language learning classes there, because, again, it was just like what you just said. They're going out to meet the students on their own terms, like in a space that they're comfortable communicating in, and they found great success with that. So it's definitely a very important thing to consider. Yeah. So how about Phill? How about your greatest experience?
Yeah. Similar to Zach, my greatest experience is definitely when students that don't initially identify as gamers become like avid gamers or like playing games.
Mm-hmm.
There were a few students in 2 summers ago who were very reticent to like join in the game playing, but because their grade depended on them learning and teaching games.
Mm-hmm.
And they were excellent students, they would come into the game lab and they would practice it. And by the end of the semester, they were just going in and playing for fun and like exploring new games,
Mm-hmm.
which was a great story for me to hear. Because again, like there's a lot of depth and community that you can build when you start to venture out of your comfort zones. So that was nice to see. Yeah, I would say that is one of the greatest things I've seen. Other things are when instructors will implement something in a class, like a small part. They'll integrate like a small game into their class, and then that will actually have ripple motivational effects across the rest of it. Like students will get interested or engaged with other parts of the course based on the angle that they were able to examine something from because of the game that they were playing first. And when students like self-report that kind of thing, that's really nice to hear from me. Those are the two main sort of, okay, I did it right this time kind of things.
That's very cool. Yeah, it's definitely the coordination of getting these things delivered as well, and making sure that people can and that's another thing you're mentioning. You had students who were kind of reticent to it. They weren't really into it at the time, and to get them really over that bridge and get them into this new form of learning is, and this is a really challenging thing for me. This is one of my biggest challenges, because to be totally honest with you, I haven't had, in the years that I've used video games in classes, I don't want to be negative, but I just want to say I've never had a perfect year or a perfect semester. And I've always had some form of pushback from students or from the administration or something like that. And I have similar experiences to both of you. And I do have, I've had students who've been really into it, had students who really enjoy the opportunity to use a new medium in class. And I've also had the opposite. Like, I've had chunks of the class who just say, this isn't for me. And because it's a game, it's not really a serious thing. Like, it's a game, right? This is a video game. It's not even like it's funny. They'll take tabletop games more seriously, or like games that we play in class, like teacher led, whatever kind of, or Kahoot or something like that. They take those kinds of games a lot more seriously than they're taking video games, which was just a really interesting thing for me. So that kind of brings me directly from my most positive into my most negative sort of experience. And I probably one of my most negative was, actually, we have a program in Canada where we actually do an exchange. And I'm not sure if you know, but in the eastern side of Canada, there's a French-speaking side. And on the west side, and almost everywhere else everywhere else is English-speaking, but a lot of Canada is English-speaking, right? And so we had this program. We had a bunch of French students come in, and I was teaching English to a bunch of French students. And I had sort of the opposite effect of what Zach had when he had like some of the students who never had the opportunity to play games. I had students who also, especially like the female students, who didn't have an opportunity to play games before. They didn't have an opportunity to really use games in their classrooms, and they didn't even play games in their IRL, in their real lives as well. And one of the things that happened, what was really unfortunate, is when we're starting, we had about 3/4 of the students really into the games, really tackling the grammar focus, really doing what they wanted to do and having fun with it. And a lot of them even wanted to do it after class. They downloaded the games, they played them on their own time and everything like that. But on a few occasions, I would get like these cliques of girls. Typically, it kind of felt like a scene out of Mean Girls. I'm not sure if you've ever seen that movie, but you'd get one girl who would stand up and say, "Oh, video games, they're not cool. They're for nerds. I'm not a nerd. I don't want to tarnish my reputation with this kind of thing. You guys can go ahead and play. I'm just gonna sit here, and all the other cool girls, if you want to go sacrifice your reputation, you go over there and play. Otherwise, you can come over here and sit with me and do your nails and stuff like that." And it was such a shock for me, because I kind of came into this, and I've only been doing this for about 3 or 4 years now, but I was under the impression that at this point in time, video games were very universal, and I've seen so many female gamers and even like pro league gamers, esports athletes, and just in general, people women who love to engage in video games, but for some reason, it's still socially taboo enough that a whole group of them would decide that no, they're not having this. They're just not going to participate in any of them, no matter what, just for the plain reason that it is a video game. And so that was my worst experience, and it made me feel really bad, because the whole goal of classes and teaching really for me is to really help the students socialize, build relationships, have fun, and enjoy whatever the topic is that we're learning. And I felt like in that sense, by introducing video games, I kind of failed them. But again, this was only for this like specific group, especially for the French Canadian, like the Westerner kind of people. But when I use these in international classes, I had similar experiences to Zach, where I had women from Middle Eastern countries who never had the chance or even the privilege, I guess, to be able to play games, and they loved it. They had such a great experience. But for some reason, the the local North American crowd there, I had a few issues with that. So, anyways, that was my worst experience. I don't know if you guys want to add anything to that, or if you want to mention your most challenging experiences. You can go ahead and weigh in there.
Yeah, so it reminds me, your negative experience reminded me of a definite failure that I've had to think about a lot, and that's uh, so another way that I help or that I try to get games integrated into classrooms is to think about sort of um, the pillars of game design. So like giving people the ability to fail safely
Mm.
is important and is very useful in classrooms. And then also the feeling of efficacy, like they're good at this, they can do it, right? Like I always think of Metroid and how Metroid models like wall jumping for you,
Mm.
and then like gives you a few safe chances to practice it before they start throwing like things that will damage you in it, but always gives you another chance to do it again. Um, and so this is sort of like the gameful model. And so at the beginning of a course that I was helping design, it was basically like, here's just a million assignments and you can do whatever you want. And each assignment is worth a certain amount of points. And here's the grading scale. And you need to get like 8,000, what was it, 1,847 points for an A or something like that. And the feedback that we got was like, I was overwhelmed. I didn't even know where to start. All of the deadlines were at the end of the semester, and I just sat there with choice paralysis.
Mm.
And so, like the failure to give a framework for students that needed a framework was what I now know is the opposite of universal design, where if you create additional frameworks, it doesn't hurt the people that don't need it, but it does empower the students that do need it.
Mm.
And I definitely that was a rookie mistake where I thought I had enough framework, but it turns out you can never have enough framework. Again, because if your game is modeled in such a way that it's optional for the people that are highly proficient in whatever it is you're framing or scaffolding, then that's good. And again, you can never have too much to help everyone down the line in proficiency. So that's I consistently ask myself, how can I give more framework for this? Not necessarily structure, but a framework for integrating into it. And I find often that I fail in that at least 2 or 3
Mm.
times.
Yeah, for me, there's always whenever I start my so in my social studies class, it's always fine because even if certain kids don't want to play, they're at least willing to watch another student play it. In my literature course, there's always like a slight hump right at the beginning where some students come in with certain expectations of what they think a video game class is going to look like. And then the texts that I'm choosing end up being drastically different than what they're accustomed to. And that's on both ends of the spectrum. So like some of my students were like, oh, video games are just for kids. They're just time wasters. It's whatever. And then usually by like after a couple classes, they're like, oh, this is a lot different than what I was expecting. But then a lot of my, and especially not to generalize, but a lot of my boys go home, they play Call of Duty, they play Grand Theft Auto, right? And then, so in their mind, that's gaming. So then when they come into my class and now they're playing as a teenage girl slowly walking through a house and looking through all the nooks and crannies of a house, that's very different than what they had expected a game that they were going to play to be. So there is a slight hesitation at the beginning, but usually once they get into the story and the narrative, it starts to change. But there is always a bit of like pulling teeth at the very beginning of the course, which I haven't figured out the best way. Maybe that's just the natural part of it and it's fine. But so you have to like, there's not always 100% buy-in at the beginning. You kind of have to like coax them into it a little bit.
I was going to say that sounds very similar to like the differing expectations that Adam was dealing with, right? Like and getting over that hump of like expectations versus reality. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But sorry, keep going.
That's pretty much, I mean, other than that, like I had a game freeze once and lost like 30 minutes, but like, so like
no.
occasionally there might be a tech issue, but other than that, there's nothing, I haven't encountered something as drastic as like a whole group of people like just not engaging with it.
Yeah, actually, what Phill mentioned there about really not ever having enough framework and not having enough kind of introduction to how to do the game or how to engage in the activity, that was my first and probably biggest mistake that I ever made when using video games in my class, is not going into it with uh, the conception that not all students are going to be able to just sit down and play this, and ones that sit down and play it. And I had the first time I tried it, I had a really big negative reaction from students, because one of the games that we played, actually, was the Keep Talking and No One Explodes. The controls of the game, and like, even though it's something, and for me as someone who games, like the concept of just being able to move around a box and click on a button and just like do really, really super simple, like very minimal keyboard commands, to me that was extremely simple. And I was just going into that, oh, everyone's going to be able to sit down, plug and play, do this, no problem whatsoever. Of course, I gave them a basic rundown of how you control it and how you use it and everything like that. But one of the things I didn't realize was, like, some students sat down and they got really frustrated because they couldn't wrap their heads around these controls and how they do it. And especially in a game like Keep Talking and No One Explodes, where basically it's like a one team game, right? Like, you're all trying to work together. And if you're the weak link in a group, it doesn't matter what activity you're doing, you're going to feel bad about that. And you're going to come away from that feeling depressed or feeling really negative, or something like that. So that was definitely a really hard lesson to learn. But it's also a really difficult thing because, there's not only the actual proficiency, but there's also students, they have their own perceived proficiency. So they might actually not be that bad at it, but they have these kind of socio-cultural predictions of themselves that, like, I am this, therefore I cannot do this, or, oh, I've never been able to do this. So, like, right from the get-go, they're saying they can't, and when you say you can't from the beginning, then you're not going to be able to do it anyways. But that was a really, really big issue I found for that kind of thing, like not having the framework in place. And this is something going forward as well, and this is something perhaps a lot of other teachers who see this will be wondering, like, how can I make sure that this framework is set up sufficiently so that all my students can enjoy this experience? And Zach, you mentioned, like, sometimes you give the students turns and sometimes they take turns, some of them don't want to go or something like that. Like, what do you both think is the way, how can you approach this as a teacher from the framework, how you get into the whole process to make sure that no one gets left behind or feeling bad?
So one method that I tend to use, not in my social studies class, in my literature course, is I always start the game off teaching like mood, tone, and mood, tone, and setting.
Mm-hmm.
Where we just stay in like whatever little introduction area of the game just to get a feel of the game, and we'll pass the controller around to everyone in the class to give them a couple minutes just to figure out the controls. And then we just have conversations about the setting or the mood or the tone. And then after that, we'll go into, okay, this student's playing for the day, this student's playing for the day, this student's playing for the day. But at least they get a little bit of just an introductory course with other people not even really paying attention to them, where they can just mess around with the controls, and no one's relying on them to get to the next area in the game. That's not always perfect, because then by the time a student does come back and play, they've already forgotten everything, but it at least gives them some context of the controller.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and how about for you, Phill, as an educational designer? How are you making sure this all works?
Yeah, mostly by using board games. That used to be the answer. These days, it's about framing and instructions, like Zach said, just making sure that there are good tutorials. And if a tutorial isn't possible, then pairing up students with proficiencies and making sure that you've got a wide variety. So small group play is mainly the method, is what I'm getting at, where we make sure that there are a range of abilities and proficiencies in the group, and then making sure that each of those have important roles to play in whatever the outcomes are of experiencing it. Yeah.
Well, that's a really interesting idea as well, and looking at the different proficiencies of different people and grouping them accordingly. That also it's something that never occurred to me. It's very cool.
Yeah, it actually it came about because there's an instructor who does similar work. He teaches primarily in small group learning, team-based learning. That's what it is. And so team-based learning, he gives his students an actual personality test, and they've had great success creating teams by setting that out. And there's it's been very effective. And so small group learning, especially in video games where, as Zach said, there are people that will just sort of watch at first, and then you can slowly draw them into actually playing the game eventually. If you give them the opportunity and the path to do so. So handing the controller back to boards, and then also giving them the time to sort of mess around like back in the day at lunch periods or whatever.
Yeah, it's very cool. And and something you both mentioned about just letting people play around with it as well, and just giving them that space. And that was something that, it can be challenging, especially if you're like Zach, playing these games that are from your own Steam library or something like that, or you have your own equipment you're bringing in, or even if it's something that's available to the school. For me, getting lab time, we have 3 computer labs and 65 instructors just in my department. So being able to get that time to let students kind of play around with it and sort of get acclimatized to it, it's a big benefit, definitely, but it's also very challenging, right? Yeah. And so I also wanted, before we go on to at the very end, I want to talk about some of the popular myths about video games in classes. But before that, I just wanted to ask each of you, if a teacher here wants to incorporate a game in their class, just something maybe like a really simple approach, how would you recommend that they approach this? What are the steps that they can take?
So from an instructional design perspective, the smallest possible step should always be your first step. So teachers should play a game themselves first, and then see what goals that sort of maps to for their class. That's my first step. What goal are you trying to get to?
Start with one that's mechanically easy or more simple to use, right? I brought because my students are obsessed with Super Smash Brothers, I use Super Smash Brothers in one of my lessons, but that is a mechanically more challenging game, unless you're just button mashing, but there's a lot going on with the controller in that game. So it's really, a lesson like that would be tailored for a specific type of student. But if you start off with something much more simple, like a game like Papers, Please, is mechanically you just point and click with the mouse. So it's a lot easier for anyone to engage with. So figure out what content are you teaching, find a game that matches that content, and then find something that is not challenging to learn the mechanics of.
Yeah, definitely. So being able to find something that teachers, first of all, go in and determine whether or not, because one of the other things I often see on Facebook or in a lot of the teachers groups is teachers just ask for advice from other teachers about just, what are some games you use in your class? And, it might not relate to their major, what they're actually teaching. There are the games, of course, you could probably find a way to spin off some game as being beneficial to almost every different major, but there are certain games that really lend themselves more to like for example in social studies, looking at something like Papers, Please would just be amazing because you have this great example of like what is it, like looking at people's faces and judgment and all those kinds of things. And actually, while I'm speaking of this, a plug for Zack's website, HeyListenGames.org. Amazing resources. And I was actually reading through your resource the other day, Zack, on Papers, Please. Just amazingly put together. Yes, it's very wonderful.
Yeah. Thank you. And I'd like to add on that. So like none of the, maybe there's like one or two, but all the lessons that I use are not from like educational games. These are not games made, they were not meant to teach someone per se. Like even Lucas Pope, the guy who developed Papers, Please, is on record saying he was not making some type of political or educational statement. He just wanted to make a game that was fun, right? And if someone walks away with some new knowledge, then sure. But like he did not go out with the intent of teaching people. And I find that games in that capacity that were made more for entertainment purposes are better, right? Because they're first and foremost about having fun. And then what you learn is kind of like intertwined with having fun. Whereas an educational game, and some of them are good, so like a lot of them have their place, but a lot of them, like fun is the reward instead of it being, fun is a reward for like learning the knowledge first, instead of like them happening together, if you know what I mean.
It sounds like you're talking about like authentic texts, right? Like it's the same reason that people don't like textbooks and then use like modern literature to teach.
Yeah,
in,
and like
in that genre.
And students don't want to be tricked into learning. Like so, some educational games are really good. Like I played Oregon Trail in school and it was fine, but it wasn't great by any means. But like we knew that we were being tricked into learning about the history of the Oregon Trail, and it takes away some of it. Whereas the game is just more like authentic, as Phill put it, right? The kids know that, right? And then that it makes a difference.
Question for you: did you have the third person shooting the buffalo or the first person shooting the buffalo Oregon Trail?
Oh, I don't remember.
Okay, because like my formative memories, my formative memory of Oregon Trail is that the one that I grew up playing in my friend's house, like it was like a third person, like you'd move around on a map, almost like asteroids, to like hunt and do food. And then I got to school and I was like, Oregon Trail, yeah. And I hated it because it was essentially a first person view where you move a reticule over it instead of like, and that really, I think, now that I'm thinking about it, informed the kinds of games I play because I'm way more into like Diablo than I am like Overwatch. So first person versus third person, all the way back to Oregon Trail. Complete aside, I apologize.
No, that's totally true too. You know, like what you start off playing and things that you get into, they often affect what you end up playing later on in life as well. You get influenced by those things. And the thing I really like what you mentioned there, Phill, is that authenticity factor. And that's the first thing that I was thinking about. And when we're talking about using video games in education, one of the big things that I know...
That wasn't me.
Sorry. Oh, no, you brought up authenticity. You mentioned that word. Just that factor is just such a huge thing. And one thing that we often talk about in like any kind of conference about using games in education is that educational games suck. Like the ones that are designed for education, more often than not, they suck. And the very reason for that, like Zack said, is it's like being tricked into learning. And students realize, like when they're sitting down to play a game, like when I actually consult some schools that teach younger children, like anywhere from 6 to 12 years old. And if you sit them down in front of a game that's an educational game, 5 seconds into it, they know this is not an authentic learning experience. They're not just in this learning something in maybe an organic way from the game, but this is something that's being force-fed to them. And it's just that authenticity just makes such a big difference in the whole experience,
Yeah, it's a weird hump that like game designers haven't gotten, or educational game designers haven't gotten over yet. Because there are games, and I suppose it's just maybe a two-part design process, but Yeah, when you try to create an educational game, it ends up neither being educational nor a game, and that's a bummer.
Yeah, I've
That's
definitely
it.
heard that.
If you do, I don't know if Zach was just being kind to the genre, but if there are educational games that have a place, I would love to hear about them. Just to examine them from an interesting design perspective.
Yeah, when I said that there are some good ones, I was just thinking like not I'm thinking for like really younger kids. So like once
Right.
you're in
So
middle school, even elementary and high school, like that at that point I don't find them super useful. But when I was 3 or 4, I was super into Reader Rabbit and I loved that. So
yeah,
but
yeah,
like how 3-year-olds interact with games is not the same as how a 16-year-old will interact
right.
with a game
Because
usually.
yeah, and that's interesting because at that point they found a good audience for that kind of thing, right? Where like you are still just straight up learning to type, and so your proficiency is increased, but that's something you want to do anyway. So that's
Mhm.
the parallel proficiency games maybe is a thing to look at. Good point there. Thanks.
Yeah, so no, this is a very Reader Rabbit. I was thinking about that.
I played that a whole bunch and Magic School
Yeah,
Bus that too.
Oh
and
yeah.
Where in the world is Carmen San Diego, right? Like that's
Yes. Oh, I love that game.
right. And straight up an educational game that was good. So these are places to start.
Yeah. The unfortunate thing is I was so into that game, but I feel like right now the amount of geography knowledge that I actually pulled from that game is very little. I think I got a little bit more into the game than I did into the actual education and learning side of it. But and that's another thing too. A game can be designed for education, and there's that balance where if it's a little bit too fun and it leaves the educational side, or if it just doesn't include sort of the pedagogical foundation that make it into something that provides quote unquote good learning, it can definitely be. It might not serve its purpose in the way that it was originally designed to do, but that's just the way of things, right? All right, so I was going to go on to sort of some myths about, and this is something that I know these are myths. I'm sure you both know that these are all myths, but they're things that I still get asked about by other teachers, by professors, by like from all different levels of education, and one of the first things that I get asked is, like they say, video games are very isolating. They're socially isolating. And this is something a lot of teachers, when they see video games from the outside, they see one person, even if you're playing a multiplayer game, they see one person sitting in front of a computer, with their headphones on, doing the game. They see them by themselves. Even if they're on an esports team and they have a bunch of people sitting next to them, they're still like in their own world within the game. And they say that just that level of attention and lack of attention to other social spaces is socially isolating. And so this is just a myth, and it's something, again, I get asked this all the time. I know a lot of people, especially, I don't want to discriminate, but a lot of the older instructors and teachers that I work with have these concerns. So would you like to say anything to try to debunk this myth of games socially isolating people?
I mean, I could go on anecdotal experiences, but like I hung out with my friends more online through Call of Duty throughout high school than I did in person. So, and now one of my buddies from college, right? Most of our connection is through playing Fortnite together. So it's just like there's especially even like small groups to MMOs, right? It is a social thing, right? It's a social hobby, like inherently. I mean, I know you can play single player games, but even beyond that, if you're most people who I know, most gamers who I know, if they're playing even a single player game, right, they're then online talking with thousands of other people about that game anyway. So it's not it being isolating is just it's just factually incorrect. It might be physically isolating in some capacity, but hell, everyone on the planet is physically isolated at this moment. So like let us play.
Well, I like that kind of element of community that you mentioned there as well, and that's something that I think a lot of people don't really consider is the fact that when you're playing these games, like, not only are you talking with people, but there's kind of an element of community building in there as well, right?
Mm-hmm. Definitely, yeah.
Yeah. How about you, Phill?
Yeah, it's mostly just echoing the community building and the staying in touch with people, right? Like if someone were aggressively asking me, like, or telling me that they thought games were socially isolating, I'd ask them if they'd ever played in like a bridge or what's the other one, spades tournament, or if they played euchre, which is a very Midwestern card game. But right, and sort of like, well, why did you play that game, or like, what did you do? Did you go bowling? Like, it's about talking about building the social capital and the community building around games, definitely. And as Zach said, like, even if you're playing a single player game, like, you go out and you find like other people that are doing speed runs, if that's your specialty, or people that want to get 100% completion, and you build those communities and you share your knowledge with others, and then everyone gets enriched, for sure. Yeah.
I do know from from the academic community, there is some pushback against this concept, and there was an author named Sherry Turkle, and she wrote a really famous article called Alone Together. And she basically wrote about how, despite the fact that we are engaging through games, through social media, online, through our devices, through computers, all these kinds of things, that effectively what they've found, or what some researchers have found, is that it's actually bringing us to a state where we have increased isolation, like psychological isolation, increased levels of depression, and all other kinds of things as well. And it was an interesting counterpoint to it, but basically just saying that, this new community that we're building, and this new kind of reality that we're embarking upon here as we move into the future, where we're communicating more and more through games, through social media, that actually we're becoming more alone in a sense, and we are losing that sense of community. But I squarely place myself on your sides on this one. I don't know what you guys have. You guys observed this? Oh, please go ahead.
Yeah, there's a huge my response to that, I would say, and if I have to write a paper, then so be it, I'll write a paper. But the difference between social media and online sociability is huge. There's a wild variance between my Facebook feed and the private Discord channels that I'm a part of that are for domain-specific games, right? And I think that that's an important distinction to draw when talking about online gaming and communities of practice around that sort of thing. That's where I would start.
What do you think about that, Zach?
I totally agree with that. I still have a Facebook account, but I don't like to go there. So, because I don't like whatever I'm seeing happening on that platform, and what's happening with the platform in the background, in general. But even like, I am on Twitter a lot, but even like Twitter, they're not like, I play with my friends, you know what I mean? And that's very different than interacting with a couple thousand strangers. So like, even if I am socially active on the internet, and you do build some like actual relationships and groups. Like, I met you, Adam, through the internet and Twitter, but that's not the same as like, I have friends from when I was a child that I still play video games with, right? And that is how we communicate and have like speaking conversations, not even just like texting or liking a Twitter post or message on Facebook, right? It's different. We're actually talking to each other.
Yeah, totally. And actually, what Phill mentioned there is something I didn't really consider very much before, the difference between that, online sociability and social media, and really a lot of the relationships that I make in these online games. Like, I played Final Fantasy XIV for quite a while there, and my fiance joined as well. And, we got really close with groups of people on Discord and people who you talk about real life stuff. And it's funny because you do talk about real life stuff, of course, on Facebook and on social media as well. But then there's there's definitely a difference in how the content goes over, how the relationships are built, and it definitely feels like a lot more of a walking down the street how we used to do back in the 70s and 80s, and you'd say hi to someone you're passing by on the street, and you might talk with them more, build a friendship, build a relationship, something like that. It feels like a lot more like that kind of style. But then on social media, I'm not sure what to liken it to. I can't really liken it to any other human experience. I don't know.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That social media is a gigantic platform, and that humans have not caught up yet with how to properly parse it. And so dialing it back down to the more like playing games with your friends and like smaller communities that are more meaningful and have specific goals is has been enriching for me. Certainly far more enriching than scrolling Facebook. So doom scrolling, gloom scrolling, I think is a coin term. Yeah.
I've never heard that. Does that mean just scrolling down infinitely or something like that?
Yep, until you've filled up on the doom of the moment, I think, yeah. That's how my friend described it to me.
I love that. Yeah. Well, I think I'll just cover one more thing here. Are you guys okay for time? Or
can go a few more minutes, yeah.
Okay. I'll just do one last short myth here. And this is something, again, that I get quite a lot from my colleagues, a lot of the people that I advise for EdTech and stuff. When people talk about games, the first thing that they say is that games are not meaningful forms of expression. And they say, for example, things like, oh, like Super Mario, you step on turtle shells, and you like Sonic the Hedgehog, you just run around like a hamster maze on a screen or something like that. And they quote these sources, or talking about fighting games, and just saying that there's no content here, there's no context, there's no expression, there's nothing we can really glean that is meaningful from this. And this is something I hear quite a lot. So then they ask me, well, so why should I use games when this is the case? So
show them the outcry that just occurred with The Last of Us Part 2. And tell me that people are not attached to characters and stories, because, first of all, beautiful, remarkable game. I think it's not perfect. I understand why some people might criticize it. Realistically, I know there's a lot of trolling and just people review bombing it before they've even played it. But like, the fact that a game can be so controversial, right, shows that that's complete nonsense, right? Show anyone the opening scene of the first Last of Us and tell me that that's not like amazing storytelling, right? Exactly. I mean, people have to get past like, oh, games are just Mario or Call of Duty, right? The kind of stereotypical things that people who are not familiar with the industry think of when they think of video games or Mortal Kombat. Like, when people think of fighting games, like that's where they go usually, if they're not accustomed to actually playing many games themselves.
Yeah, like Zach said, Last of Us 2 and all of the other sort of experience games where they tell an excellent story is what I would point to as well, certainly.
And then not even the cinematic ones, like show people a game like Undertale, right, or Celeste, or even these much smaller indie games, right, that focus so heavily on narrative, right? There's so much there that's not just, right, gameplay. And like in those games, like gameplay is a mechanic that reinforces the storytelling.
Or like the lesson of the game, right? Especially for Undertale. No spoilers.
Yeah, and also one other thing that I've just really been impressed with games, especially a little bit more recently, is how they're doing the same thing as movies and books have done in the past to show children that there are role models, very diverse role models that they can look up to and follow and be inspired by. And this is something, like, I know when I was young this wasn't always the case, but nowadays we have people of all different races and people from all different things, like all different, the LGBTQ community and all these different representations. And I know that was a big contention point for The Last of Us Part 2 as well. And people are mentioning, I think it was about the female lead character in that, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, you had a huge amount of people saying, I'm so happy that finally there's representation of people like me in these games. I can actually play someone who is in that kind of situation. And I was playing Assassin's Creed Odyssey recently, and it's the same kind of thing. Like there's no, I know Ubisoft Montreal, they pride themselves in really building a lot of diversity and a lot of trying to take in different perspectives into the game. And you can go in as a main character, and it doesn't matter if you're like what your orientation is in the game. You can, if you want to, you can have a relationship with anything that moves, kind of thing, right? And there's nothing that looks back and makes a comment about those specific relationships or anything. And I just feel like that is just a very powerful thing, that you can go through something like these games and they make it seem, they normalize these things. And I feel like they're a huge part in normalizing culture that perhaps is not yet, unfortunately, not yet considered mainstream. And, like we were talking about the Black Lives Matter movement at the beginning of this, and how now, we're looking more at African American game designers and games that feature African Americans as lead characters, and seeing how we can. I'm very excited, maybe for the next 5 or 10 years, where we can play these games and we can play as diverse characters and not have to stop and think, this doesn't seem right, or this doesn't seem like a normal thing to happen. And it's
quick shout out to Extreme Meat Punks Forever. It's a video game by Heather Flowers. Are y'all familiar with it?
I haven't heard that one.
No is a fine answer. Yep. It's Extreme Meat Punks Forever is kind of like Pacific Rim meets beating up fascists in the American Southwest. It's incredibly worth paying the money for, specifically because it has a wild amount, like just an excellent amount of diversity. It's written and created by a diverse group of people. It's well worth checking out. Extreme Meat Punks, meat, MEAT, punks forever. Like I said, Pacific Rim meets beating up fascists.
That sounds great. I will definitely check that out. Extreme Meat Punks. All right, I think I'll wrap things up here. I want to thank both of you so much. So thank you so much, Phill and Zack, for coming out and talking with us today and showing us that video games are a really great solution for learning in our classes, and definitely something worth exploring, if not just for the fun factor, but most importantly for the education factor and how we can actually in a pedagogically sound way, use these in our classrooms. And I'm so grateful for having you both here and sharing your time with us here.
Yeah, happy to share. Happy to listen.
Absolutely.
Zach, I'm excited to explore your website for sure. Thank you.
Oh, cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
Do you have any resources or anything like that you'd like to share as well, Phill, before we go? Or
shout out to Extreme Meat Punks Forever.
Yeah.
Undertale already got mentioned. My favorite designer right now, their name is, give me just a moment, sorry. So the game that you can purchase again from itch.io is called Our Haunt.
Okay.
It's you can play it digitally. It's by Sword Queen Games. They're out of totally forgot where they're out of, with apologies. But Sword Queen Games is the dev company, and then if you go to itch.io and search for Our Haunt, that will bring up all their games. Those are excellent games for conversation starting, and specifically the mechanics are around empowering players and leveling the narrative field. So video games are like a story you experience. Tabletop games are usually a conversation, and those are really great for making sure everyone is included. So that's my shout out.
Very cool.
I just want to echo, especially for teachers, go to itch.io, because there are thousands of great indie games that could be solid starting points for using some games in the classroom, especially since a lot of them are free. You're obviously more than welcome to donate to the developers who made these games, but a lot of them, right, they are free to start with, and a lot of them are playable in web browsers, right? So there's low tech demand, but that's kind of that I've spent a lot of time browsing through there and finding a good library of games to use.
All right, I'm going to put links to all of these in the description below here in the video, and also a link to Zach's website and whatnot there as well. Zach also does a Twitch live stream every week. I was just there last night.
Playing Last of Us.
Yeah, playing The Last of Us.
Excellent. Cool.
Yes.
I will follow your stream too.
And that's a group of different streamers. It's a small organization called Geeks Like Us. And they're mostly psychologists who use gaming in their practice. So they usually play games and talk about mental health and how they use video games or tabletop games like D&D in their own practice. And I'm their teacher perspective. So every Wednesday at 7:30 Eastern Standard Time, I use a game that I've taught with or plan on teaching with. So like right now we're playing through the first Last of Us because that's a game I'm going to play with my seniors come next school year.
Yeah,
so definitely come to that. I would love to have more teachers in the chat, or anyone in the chat, really.
For sure, yeah. You come out, there are a lot of great people in the chat there, and great experiences. Teachers can come in and you can ask Zach all your questions about how he's using games there, and he'll try his best to simultaneously play the game and answer all your questions at the same time there. But it's a very wonderful experience. All right, so thank you again. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Nope, just saying thanks.
Oh, yes. Thank you, both of you, again, for coming out. Really enjoyed talking with you both. And hopefully sometime in the future, maybe we'll be able to have the good fortune to talk again and maybe talk some more about video games and answer some more questions from people. So
yeah, that sounds cool. Nice to meet you, Zach. Nice to see you, Adam.
Nice to meet you.
Yes, and nice to have you all together. And have a wonderful day. Okay.